Some truths do not echo, they dissolve, like footprints in a rising tide. This story begins in the silent heart of Venice, where a body was found adrift and a nation's secret sank with it. As Holmes and I return to London, what haunts us is not the crime itself, but the justice left undone. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us walk beside Holmes once more, into the silence that even the empire dared not name. There are cities that whisper and others that wail, but Venice, Venice grieves in silence. Hers is the mourning of water against stone, of footsteps swallowed by alleys that twist not just in space, but in time. It was in this city of reflections, where beauty walks hand in hand with decay, that Holmes and I were drawn into one of the most sombre episodes of our shared career. It is no light matter when a corpse turns up in a foreign capital, but it is graver still when the corpse bears no name, no documents, and no official history. I recall the letter that brought us into that ancient lagoon city. It was not an invitation, but an invocation. The crime did not announce itself with gunshots or screams, but rather through omission, through absence, evasion, and the fear that travels in diplomatic pouches. Little did I know, as I stood by the window of our Baker Street sitting room and watched the rain fret against the panes, that Venice would soon press its watery hand upon our shoulders, not merely as a case, but as a reckoning. The telegram came by way of the Foreign Office, though the envelope bore no crest. Holmes received it with a glance as cool as the steel nib with which he broke the seal. He read it once, then again, and then folded it into precise quarters and tucked it into his breast pocket. I waited for a comment, a name, a destination, a hint, but received none. He merely rose, crossed to the fireplace and drew down the railway map from the wall. Venice, he said at last, as if naming a diagnosis rather than a place. We are summoned by Sir Reginald Hartley. A diplomatic matter, a corpse, a canal. He left the room and returned with his travelling case already half packed, a sign more telling than any exclamation. When I inquired as to the nature of the death, he merely replied, "It is not the death that concerns them, Watson. It is the possibility that someone may start asking the wrong questions about it." I have come, over the years, to know the varying shades of Holmes's introspection. There is the brittle intensity of an unsolved cipher, the nervous detachment before a confrontation, and the philosophical calm that follows an arrest. But on the morning of our departure, I observed something rarer, a stillness without anchor, a quiet not born of rest, but of burden. He spoke little during our preparations, save to ensure that I had packed both my medical bag and my formal evening wear. These are the marks of a case that might touch both flesh and reputation. "You seem preoccupied," I ventured at one point, as we settled into the cab that would take us to Charing Cross. Holmes offered a half smile that did not reach his eyes. "The trouble with water, Watson," he murmured, "is that it remembers nothing. It does not preserve, it only swallows." The journey across the continent was long, but not unpleasant. The rhythm of the rails lulled one into a kind of suspended alertness, while the passing landscape, from the grey vales of France to the snow-veined spines of the Alps, served as a kind of optical opiate. Holmes sat opposite me, cloaked in the same stillness that had marked him since the telegram's arrival. He smoked sparingly, but studied intensely, laying before him a series of documents and maps. Among them, I glimpsed a confidential roster from the Foreign Office, the corner of which bore the name Hayward, C.T., in faded ink. As the train dipped into a Swiss tunnel, I could not help but reflect on how many of our journeys had begun thus, with shadows on paper and the echo of a name. Yet this time, there was no triumph in Holmes's expression, no thirst for game or glory, only something grim, like a physician who knows the diagnosis but dreads to speak it. "What do you make of Venice, Holmes?" I asked, hoping to draw him out. "I make of her," he replied without lifting his eyes. A city perfectly suited for secrets that float until they don't. Venice greeted us with that peculiar blend of beauty and fatigue that no other city possesses. The air was thick with brine and incense, and the sky hung low, its colour that of tarnished silver. We disembarked not at a station of iron and coal, but at the Vaporetto dock, where the Grand Canal moved with ancient indifferent grace. Sir Reginald Hartley was waiting for us at the foot of the narrow stone landing, his posture impeccable but his eyes flecked with unease. He was a man of the old colonial mould, crisp moustache, pressed linen, and the sort of guarded civility that concealed as much as it conveyed. He offered no greeting beyond a clipped, "This way, gentlemen," and gestured toward a gondola moored discreetly behind a mooring post. Holmes said nothing but stepped aboard. I followed, noting the peculiar absence of official escort or embassy flag. We drifted into the network of lesser canals, not the ones immortalized on postcards, but those that felt forgotten even by the city's own memory. The gondola moved silently through passages of water that gleamed like oil, flanked on either side by shuttered windows and crumbling stone. The only sound was the occasional drip of moisture from eaves above, and the rhythmic dip of the gondolier's oar. Sir Reginald sat forward, his voice low and taut. "The body was found yesterday. Male, British, no identification, but I believe you will find the tattoo on his shoulder. Suggestive. He was last seen in the company of persons we do not wish to be connected with. The official report will read robbery, but certain signatures do not align." "Do you have a name?" Holmes asked, his voice devoid of inflection. Hartley's gaze did not shift. "Not one I intend to utter aloud until we are behind locked doors. Officially, he never existed." Holmes said nothing more. The gondola slipped under a narrow arch, and I found myself chilled, not by the water, but by the knowledge that we were entering a case where even the name of the dead must be drowned. The Venetian hospital to which we were conducted lay not in the fashionable San Marco district, but farther inland, past the withering grandeur of once noble palazzi, and through alleys where sunlight dared not linger. Its name, etched in worn Latin above a weathered arch, evoked saints and mercy. Yet as we descended into its lower vaults, it was neither sanctity nor charity that hung in the air, but the odour of carbolic acid and damp stone. A clerk, young and monosyllabic, led us with a lantern in hand, past a corridor of shuttered windows. The further we walked, the more the building seemed to shed its civilized veneer. The floor grew uneven, the walls more porous, and the hush more absolute. Only our footsteps and the faint trickle of water in unseen drains accompanied us. The room into which we were shown was austere, its walls tiled in white and ceilings supported by thin groins of brick. On the central table, polished steel beneath harsh light, lay the object of our journey, a corpse, waxen and swollen, his limbs arranged with a detached professionalism that, to my trained eye, spoke more of bureaucratic necessity than medical inquiry. Holmes stood silent beside me, eyes narrowed. It was not the body he studied, not at first, but the silence of the place, and the shadows that moved not with our breath, but with what had been deliberately left unsaid. The man, in life, had likely been of average height and build, but death had distorted both. The skin bore the blotched pallor of prolonged water exposure, yet despite the inevitable transformation, there remained certain signs that resisted time's erasure. "There is no identification," said the coroner flatly, joining us at the table. "No wallet, no travel papers, nothing." "Not entirely nothing," murmured Holmes, and gestured to the left shoulder. There, just beneath the clavicle, partially obscured by decay, was the fading outline of a tattoo, a circular mark, with 3 narrow lines radiating downward like feathers. Beside it, faint bruising suggested recent impact or restraint. Holmes leaned in, careful not to touch. "This mark is not decorative, it is institutional." "And the ring," I said, pointing to the man's right hand. Though swollen and stiff, the finger still bore a tarnished silver band, its inner face engraved with minute lettering. Holmes peered at it through his lens. Hand-cut, English silver, worn inwards, suggesting the wearer did not intend it to draw attention. He looked to the coroner. "And yet you list him as unidentified." "I listed him as unknown," came the reply, "which is not, strictly speaking, a lie." Holmes gave a slight dry smile. "Indeed, the kind of truth most useful to the diplomatic service." Holmes continued to examine the ring, drawing from his coat a folded paper, evidently prepared in anticipation, on which I recognized a series of insignia. "The symbol on this ring," he said softly, "was used by a highly discreet communication network operating between Trieste and Kotor during the final years of the Austro-Hungarian disputes. It was known informally among certain circles as the Vesper Line. Messengers who travelled under false identities, often by steamer or diplomatic courier." He tapped the edge of the paper. "The owl motif, seen here with inverted wings, was adopted as a sign of silent observation. It was said that when an owl looked directly at you, the message was already lost or intercepted." I stared at the ring, its meaning suddenly magnified. Then the man was not merely a foreigner, he was a carrier. "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "Or perhaps more than that. There are those who carry messages and those who carry consequences." He turned once more to the coroner. "You have no record of him entering the city?" "None. No hotel registry, no police record. He was found in a quiet canal behind Campo San Giacomo dell'Orio. No one claims to have seen him alive." Holmes was silent for a moment and then said, almost to himself, "No one claims, but that does not mean no one did. It was not the carabinieri who led us to the gondolier, but a hospital porter who whispered the name with the nervous pride of one about to betray a minor secret. We found the man outside, leaning against the wall in the courtyard beside a small basin of rainwater, pipe in hand, and eyes as narrow as the canals he knew so well. He was old, skin tanned like sailcloth, hands twisted by time. His hat, battered and ink-stained, and sat askew on his head, as if even it had learned to lean from long years of rowing. "Dawn," he said, after Holmes had pressed a lira into his palm. "I was waiting for a fare. Church bells had not yet begun. I saw him, a man in a long coat, heavy, dragging something toward the edge." "The edge of what?" Holmes asked. "A canal near the ghetto, narrow, deep, forgotten." "And the man?" I pressed. He shook his head, face shadowed, no light. He moved quickly, dropped it, the thing, the body, and was gone. "Gone where?" The old man gave a shrug. "In Venice, signor, one need not run. One merely turns a corner and disappears." Holmes studied him a moment longer, then nodded his thanks. "Truth, like water," he murmured, "is easily disturbed, but rarely still." Back within the morgue, Holmes turned his attention once more to the body. This time, he was methodical, removing gloves, drawing a fine glass from his pocket, and focusing on the smallest, most overlooked details. "Watson," he said, "look here." He indicated the nails, particularly those on the right hand. Beneath the ridges of keratin, caught in the slivers of dead skin, was a residue of dark green algae. "This species," he said, "grows only on the underside of certain canal steps, those submerged at all hours. It requires at least 6 hours of continuous contact to embed in this way." I frowned. "But the gondolier claimed to have seen the body dropped at dawn." "Precisely. The sun rose at 5:40. The algae requires immersion before midnight, if not earlier." He shifted slightly, examining the ears. "And this? See the sediment trapped here? It's fine silt, not from surface drift. This man was underwater long before the alleged witness rose from bed." "You mean," I began, "the gondolier lied?" Holmes straightened. "Let us not presume so quickly. He may have seen what he believed. But truth and perception are rarely the same companion. As we walked along the stone corridor, Holmes spoke in low tones, his manner more philosophical than accusatory. "The gondolier," he said, "may have seen a man deposit something in the canal, but not this body, not at that time. It is possible, Watson, that what he observed was not the act of murder, but its mimic. A diversion, perhaps, or a rehearsal, or even a message meant to be seen." He paused beside a grimy window, watching a distant skiff pass through the canal below. "In this city, truth travels by disguise, and someone, I suspect, wished very much for us to believe in the wrong hour." Before departing the hospital, Holmes requested to see the official death record. The coroner obliged, producing a slim volume bound in stained leather, whose pages bore the impersonal calligraphy of civil protocol. Holmes read the line aloud. "Un inglese, sconosciuto." A stranger, unknown, he translated, voice flat, and thus, conveniently, unclaimed by any office that might be forced to speak. He closed the book and handed it back with a faint smile. "A precise phrase, Watson, both true and utterly devoid of meaning. The dead carry no names, and that is how some would prefer them. The British consulate in Venice stands on the southern edge of the Grand Canal, its windows shuttered against the relentless Adriatic light, its walls as pale and tight-lipped as the nation it represents. There was a weight about the building that did not come from its stone, but from the centuries of quiet negotiations, sealed envelopes, and unspoken favours carried within its walls. We were received in a formal parlour whose design had not changed since the Crimean War. Stiff-backed chairs, fading tapestries, and a portrait of Queen Victoria placed as though to witness every confidence. Sir Reginald Hartley entered with the grace of one long practised in the art of diplomatic ambiguity. His handshake was firm, his expression neutral, and his every sentence measured by a silent scale. "Gentlemen," he said, after the courtesies had been dispensed with, "I trust you understand the delicacy of our position. Venice is not London. Here, perception walks faster than fact, and scandal swims where truth might drown." Holmes inclined his head without reply. I, for my part, sensed at once that we were not guests, but instruments to be wielded or silenced, as necessity dictated. With a glass of pale sherry in hand, and one arm resting languidly against the mantel, Sir Reginald began to unspool a version of the events that, I suspect, had already been drafted for dispatch to Whitehall. "The deceased," he said, "was not formally attached to this office, though he had, in previous years, served the Crown in various administrative capacities. Since then, he has been unofficial. Not insubstantial, of course, but unofficial. His presence here was personal, ill-advised perhaps, but not political." Holmes raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "There are indications," Hartley continued delicately, "that he had formed an attachment with a local woman of theatrical inclination, one Elisabetta Volterra. The circumstances of his demise may well be connected to that entanglement. A lover's quarrel, an assignation gone awry, or a fabrication designed to divert scrutiny," Holmes said quietly, almost as if to himself. Hartley offered a smile that did not alter the tension in his jaw. "There is no gain, Mr. Holmes, in pursuing ghosts when the living can be scandalized." "I find," Holmes replied mildly, "that the dead are often more forthcoming than the living, especially when one is denied access to either." It was then that Hartley placed the name before us, as one might place a sacrificial token upon an altar, as a gesture both of appeasement and strategic release. "Elisabetta Volterra," he said, reaching for a sheaf of correspondence with studied casualness, "is a mezzo-soprano with the Teatro Malibran, Jewish extraction, lives in the northern quarter. She has been associated discreetly with various members of our community, though not, I assure you, with our blessing." "A woman of charm?" I inquired. "A woman of intelligence," he corrected, "and of a disposition that lends itself to intrigue." Holmes accepted the address card Hartley extended without comment. The script was neat, almost ornamental, and written in a hand that belied no haste, as though even the burden of implication required elegance. "I trust," Hartley said, "that your investigation will be proportionate to the consequences." "Sir Reginald," Holmes replied, rising to his feet, "it is never the consequence that guides me, only the thread that binds truth to motive." Holmes remained composed throughout the exchange, his demeanour betraying neither satisfaction nor alarm. Yet I, who had sat beside him through courts and corridors, perceived a tightening behind the eyes. Not anger, but attention sharpened to its finest edge. He posed no further questions, did not challenge Hartley's sequence of assumptions, nor remark upon the obvious omissions. That in itself was telling, for when Holmes chose silence in the face of distortion, it was not acquiescence, but calculus. Hartley, for his part, seemed faintly reassured by this absence of protest, mistaking restraint for submission. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself the hint of a smile, one that rested uncomfortably upon the face, like a borrowed mask. "Should you require anything," he said, as we rose to leave, "please inform my secretary. Discretion, after all, is the last honour a gentleman may claim." Holmes inclined his head with the barest nod. "Indeed, Sir Reginald, but as you may recall, honour and silence are not always synonymous." We stepped out into the corridor, and the air seemed colder for what had not been said. We descended the stone steps of the consulate in silence, the echo of our heels oddly distorted by the vaulted entryway. Outside, the canal shimmered in grey afternoon light, a reflection without clarity, as if the city too refused to give shape to what it saw. Holmes lit a cigarette as we walked, his steps neither hurried nor idle, but guided by a rhythm of thought I had long ceased to interrupt. At last, as we turned into a narrow passage beside the Campo San Stefano, I found myself compelled to speak. "There was something rehearsed about his tone," I said. "There was everything rehearsed," Holmes replied dryly, "from the placement of the sherry decanter to the spacing of his pauses. You believe he's hiding the nature of the man's death?" "I believe," Holmes said, glancing at the passing water, "that Sir Reginald Hartley has spent so many years binding facts to official convenience that he no longer knows how to speak in any other key." The canal beside us rippled softly. Somewhere, a gondola bell rang, sharp and brief, like a warning meant only for those who still had reason to listen. Holmes stopped at the edge of the Ponte dei Pugni and leaned against the parapet. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with that dry irony which marked his most honest reflections, he observed, "The truth, when it inconveniences the powerful, is no longer truth. It becomes folklore or scandal or a whisper assigned to women and foreigners." I looked to him, waiting for more, a direction, a deduction, a plan. But he merely drew upon his cigarette and let the smoke drift upward, vanishing like a name struck from the record. The northern quarter of Venice, where the pale facades begin to wither into more intimate decay, holds a quieter sorrow than the touristed splendour near San Marco. There, between a shuttered bakery and a jeweller's shop long gone to dust, we found the narrow doorway bearing the name Volterra in faded gold. Holmes paused before it, his gloved hand resting lightly on the bell pull, as though measuring the silence behind the wood. There was no plaque, no servant, no display of status, only the faint scent of jasmine drifting from a potted plant on the sill. When at last the door opened, it did so with a restraint I had come to associate with those who have too often heard their names spoken in courtrooms or whispered through closed windows. The woman who greeted us stood tall, dark-haired, and draped in a robe of dusky blue. Her features were composed, but not indifferent, the kind of stillness that comes not from coldness, but from discipline hard won. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "and Dr. Watson, I wondered when you would arrive." Her voice was not theatrical, as I'd half expected, but low and clear, like the final note of a song not meant for an audience. She led us into a parlour that bore the quiet elegance of someone accustomed to attention but weary of it. The wallpaper was pale green, its floral motif aged but unpretentious. A piano stood against the wall, closed and dustless. Upon it lay a single sheet of music, unfinished. "I will not offer tea unless you ask for it," she said, as I dislike the pretense of hospitality when it is not wanted. Holmes offered a courteous bow. "We come not as judges, madam, but as listeners." "Then I shall speak plainly," she replied. "Yes, I knew Mr. Hayward. He came to me 3 times over the course of the last fortnight. We were not lovers, nor even confidants. I believe he sought from me something I did not possess. Answers." "What sort of answers?" I asked. She met my gaze without hesitation. "He thought I knew something of a man who vanished, an Englishman, like himself. He never said the name, but the fear in him made it unnecessary." Holmes, who had remained silent thus far, now stirred. "Fear," he repeated softly. "What kind of fear?" "The kind," she replied, "that does not concern death, but silence." Elisabetta seated herself upon the arm of a low chaise, the hem of her robe falling like a curtain over polished wood. She did not offer rehearsed stories or embroidered flourishes, only a slow unfolding like a memory brought reluctantly into the light. "Mr. Hayward came here seeking names, not for publication, nor justice. He did not want to punish anyone. He wanted only to know which hands had moved the pieces behind the curtain." Holmes listened intently. "And what curtain was that?" "The one that separates men from their governments. He told me of a British courier missing since winter, a man last seen in the Dalmatian corridor, somewhere between Spalato and Zara. It was said the man's vanished with documents, but Hayward believed the disappearance was no accident." "Why come to you?" I asked. She shrugged. "Because my father once worked in the diplomatic post at Trieste, because I sang for a minister's mistress, because in Venice, secrets pass more freely through the mouths of opera singers than ambassadors." "Did you confirm anything?" Holmes inquired. She shook her head. "I told him I knew only rumours, of shifting alliances, of quiet betrayals. He said he feared the truth would not be hidden for long. I told him he was wrong." Elisabetta excused herself to fetch a shawl, and in her absence Holmes rose without a word and began to study the room as though it were a manuscript written in invisible ink. I knew better than to interrupt. He paused beside the bookshelf, where several volumes bore the wear of careful handling. The floor beneath showed faint indentations, not recent, but clear. Someone had stood there for long periods, or often. Beside the piano, a single chair faced the window, but the cushion bore no imprint, and the sill was undisturbed by dust. It was, in essence, a tableau, not a habit. Near the writing desk, Holmes's fingers grazed the edge of an open ledger. It was filled not with music, but notes written in 2 hands, one rounded and fluid, the other angular and precise. He did not read them, but examined the spine, noting a tear that had been recently mended with waxed thread. When Elisabetta returned, she caught his glance. "Do you always read a room this way?" she asked, not unkindly. Holmes offered the faintest smile. "Only when the room has been recently altered to conceal something." There was a velvet curtain that hung beside a long case clock, its purpose decorative rather than functional, or so I assumed. But as Elisabetta turned toward the tea cabinet, Holmes stepped quietly to it and with a gentle sweep drew it back. Behind it, half concealed by a wooden niche, lay a Venetian mask. Not the delicate sort worn at carnival by noble ladies, but the long-nosed variety associated with the medico della peste, the plague doctor. It was painted in ivory and gold, with a crack along the left cheek and a velvet strap knotted loosely behind. Holmes lifted it carefully. I moved to his side, and at once noticed the faint smear upon its inner rim, Not paint, not dust, but a trace. Dark, ruddy, dried. Blood, Holmes said, almost inaudibly. Not fresh, not profuse, but present. Elisabetta said nothing. Her back remained turned as she stirred a cup with careful grace. Holmes lowered the mask to the desk, but did not replace it. His eyes did not leave her. This was not worn for theatre, he said, nor ritual. It was worn, I suspect, in silence. And not by you. No, she replied softly, but by someone I once let in. She did not approach the mask, nor did she flinch at Holmes's revelation. Instead, Elisabetta returned to her seat, folded her hands in her lap, and regarded us both with that calm intensity peculiar to those who have grown accustomed to being misunderstood. I will not ask you to return it, she said. It has been there long enough. I no longer look behind the curtain. Holmes studied her, not as a suspect, but as one might study a candle flame in a window, flickering, yes, but unyielding. Who wore it? I asked. She gave the ghost of a smile. A man who had nothing left to lose, except the lie he wore over his face. And did you aid him? I did not stop him. That, in Venice, is often the greater crime. There was a long silence. The mask rested between us like an accusation no one wished to name. Holmes reached for it again, this time not to conceal, but to weigh. Some costumes, Elisabetta said, her eyes fixed on the window, are never worn for pleasure, only for protection or penance. As we prepared to leave, Holmes extended a hand in thanks. Elisabetta took it without hesitation. There was no pretense in her farewell, only a nod and a silence that did not require words. Outside, the street had darkened. The canal shimmered with the dim reflections of lanterns now lit in windows above. Holmes walked ahead a few paces, then paused beside a bridge's edge and looked down into the water as if expecting a voice to rise from it. You saw something, I said at last. He nodded. The mask, inside the left eye hole, folded and tucked, a note, likely overlooked. You took it? Yes, he replied, though I do not yet know if I will read it. I raised a brow. That's unlike you. He glanced at me. There are truths, Watson, that are best approached in increments, especially when they may not lead to justice, but only to deeper sorrow. And with that, he resumed his step. The night folded around us as we walked, and I knew we had not left the shadow of that house, only carried a portion of it forward with us. The British Embassy in Venice is a place where nothing moves too quickly, and nothing is ever said too loudly. As we stepped beneath the pillared portico and into the cool shadow of its marble vestibule, I was struck by the hushed grandeur that clung to every corner, not the echo of statecraft in progress, but of decisions already made and buried. We were received by a dour clerk with ink-stained cuffs, who bade us follow with a murmured, "This way, gentlemen," as though even the walls might overhear. The corridors were high-ceilinged and lined with portraits of statesmen in starched uniforms, men whose expressions betrayed the peculiar weariness of lives spent crafting silences more than speeches. Holmes walked with hands clasped behind his back, his gaze flickering only occasionally toward the brass nameplates on the doors we passed. I had the distinct sense that he was not observing rooms, but studying absences. The gaps between names, the echo of a step too seldom heard. We arrived at a modest room near the rear courtyard. A secretary announced our presence and withdrew. We were left with a ticking clock, a green baize desk, and a narrow window through which no sound from the city could penetrate. Mr. Alistair Fenchurch entered with the tentative bearing of a man more familiar with stationery than with confrontation. He could not have been much past 30, but already his temples had begun to grey, and his collar, though freshly pressed, bore the signs of habitual worry. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a quick nod, then turned to me. "Dr. Watson, I've read, I've been told you were coming. Then perhaps you can save us time, Holmes said. We are seeking clarity on the status of Mr. Charles Hayward. Fenchurch blinked, sat, and folded his hands too tightly. Yes, of course, a regrettable case. Tragic, really. Holmes said nothing. The silence lengthened, and Fenchurch shifted in his chair. He was never formally recalled, he began. Rather, he resigned, quietly, voluntarily. There were complications. What kind of complications? I asked. Fenchurch hesitated. Personal. He had begun to exhibit signs of instability. He believed he was being followed, that sort of thing. Paranoia, perhaps. And yet, Holmes said, you let him remain in Venice. Fenchurch attempted a smile, but it collapsed almost instantly. His duties were no longer official. Holmes steepled his fingers. But still delicate, I presume. It is a curious reflex in bureaucratic circles. When reason fails and loyalty strains, madness becomes the final refuge of documentation. Mr. Fenchurch leaned on this familiar crutch with the desperation of a man reciting a lesson drilled into him too late. Mr. Hayward was not himself, he said again, searching our faces for signs of disbelief. He spoke of conspiracies, of betrayals within the diplomatic corps. He believed he had uncovered some network. What kind of network? Holmes asked mildly. Fenchurch waved a hand. It was vague. He mentioned the Adriatic corridor, some matter of encoded communiques and missing personnel, but there was no proof, no witnesses. Sir Reginald felt it best that he be allowed to resign quietly before the matter became embarrassing. Was he examined? I asked. Fenchurch coloured slightly. There was no formal inquest. The embassy does not interfere in such private decisions. He simply ceased to appear. A letter was received confirming his resignation. Holmes leaned forward just slightly. And this letter, it is on file? Yes, said Fenchurch, a bit too quickly. Yes, of course. Holmes's silence, I knew, was more dangerous than speech. It was Holmes himself who asked to see the internal registers, the personnel lists, travel authorizations, duty logs. The request, couched in cool professionalism, was met with a flicker of alarm that Fenchurch could not wholly mask. Nonetheless, the files were produced. I watched Holmes scan them, not with impatience, but with the eerie deliberation of a surgeon diagnosing something beneath the skin. Here, he said at last, tapping the leather-bound ledger with a long finger. This is the confidential roster, is it not? Fenchurch nodded. Holmes turned the pages slowly. Your most recent copy, dated 3 weeks ago, lists Mr. Hayward as attached, not retired, not discharged, not even on leave, simply attached. Fenchurch began to protest, but Holmes raised a hand. I understand clerical oversights, he said softly, but this is not an oversight. It is a fingerprint left on glass. Someone tried to wipe him clean and missed the edges. He closed the book gently, as one might close the eyes of the dead. Curious now, I asked if I might review the letter of resignation. Fenchurch, though clearly reluctant, complied. The document was brief, 3 sentences of courteous prose, signed in an elegant hand. Charles T. Hayward. The paper bore the official watermark, but something in the ink caught my attention. This seems different, I murmured. Holmes nodded. The typeface is inconsistent, the spacing irregular. Compare it to the resignation submitted by Mr. Lennox 2 months ago. We did so. The distinction was plain. Lennox's letter bore the precise spacing and margins of a mechanical Remington. Hayward's, however, was slightly uneven, as if produced on another model, or under different hands. Holmes then produced a magnifying glass. Observe the signature. We leaned in. It was graceful, yes, but the stroke lines were oddly uniform, without natural variation. Traced, Holmes said flatly, possibly from an earlier memorandum. The tremor in the upper loop of the H is identical, twice. Fenchurch looked pale. I had no part in... Of course not, Holmes interrupted with almost chilling calm. One does not assign such tasks to juniors. One only hands them the file when it is done. Fenchurch stood, then sat again. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his tie, and offered a smile that was all bone and no breath. Holmes observed him coolly. Your distress, Mr. Fenchurch, is most convincing, but it is not your distress that interests me. Fenchurch opened his mouth, closed it. It is Mr. Hayward's disappearance that concerns me, or rather, the speed with which he ceased to exist, on paper, and soon after, in body. I don't know anything about that, Fenchurch whispered. Perhaps not, Holmes replied, but someone does, and they have made of you a bridge, one they will gladly burn when crossed. Holmes gathered the files and replaced them with the fastidious care of a man who understood that even dust, if disturbed, speaks. He turned back to the clerk. The dead, Mr. Fenchurch, are rarely cooperative when asked to vanish completely. As we stepped once more into the bright sting of the Venetian sun, Holmes removed his gloves with quiet care and walked several paces without speaking. Finally, he said, not turning to me, "And what would you do, Watson, if it were you? If a man vanished under your roof and your superiors bid you forget him?" I hesitated. "I do not know," I said. Holmes nodded faintly. "Nor do I, but I suspect that those who do know sleep poorly." We were seated in the small parlour of our temporary lodgings near the Ponte della Tette when a knock, hesitant and irregular, interrupted Holmes mid-sentence. He rose with his usual economy of motion and opened the door to reveal a barefoot boy of perhaps 10, his face sun-browned and his shirt scorched at one shoulder. In his soot-smeared hands, he held an envelope, warped, blackened, and barely intact, which he extended silently. Holmes took it without question. The boy, once paid, vanished as only Venetian children can, slipping into the tapestry of alleyways like a page torn from view. Holmes examined the missive with interest. The seal, half melted, bore no crest. The paper was brittle to the touch, and the edges curled as though reluctant to yield what remained within. Yet something in his expression shifted, not alarm, but attention sharpened into gravity. "This," he murmured, "was never meant to reach a reader." I leaned closer. In the dimming light, the script was faint, parts lost to flame, parts smeared by moisture, and yet a few words survived with almost uncanny clarity. He opened it fully and began to read. The first line, though scorched, had survived with surgical precision. It read, "To whom it may concern in the future, if there is such a thing left to be concerned." The script was unmistakably English, in a hand I recognised from official registers. Charles T. Hayward, once aide to the diplomatic office in Trieste. But this was no formal report. The tone carried none of the clipped diction of protocol. It was weary, intimate, and irrevocably final. "I do not know if this will be read," the letter continued, "nor whether its words will matter to anyone not already paid to forget them. But I must write, if only to leave behind one honest line where so many were crooked." Holmes read silently, lips unmoving. The fire had consumed much, and yet what remained seemed curated by fate itself. A patchwork of truths rescued from deliberate oblivion. I followed the courier's trail into the Dalmatian hills. I found his satchel, never claimed. I heard his name spoken in a tongue that feared its own mouth. I returned with knowledge, and was greeted not with inquiry, but with quiet instructions to remain silent. There was no signature, only a final line, singed at its edge. "A knight who bows to foreign crowns cannot be trusted with his own." Holmes rose, crossed to the table, and laid the letter gently beneath the lamplight. He studied it with that particular quiet of his, the kind that filled a room without ever demanding attention. He read aloud, "A knight who bows to foreign crowns cannot be trusted with his own." His voice was low but firm. "This was not written for sympathy," he said, "nor for vindication. It is a record, a last will of sorts." Hayward had discovered a betrayal, not personal, but national, a courier lost, a satchel retrieved, and a truth that proved fatal. I leaned in. "He names no one." Holmes nodded, deliberately. "But the phrase, 'a knight who bows to foreign crowns,' is no metaphor plucked from poetry. It is a cipher, Watson. He writes not for the world, but for one man, a man who would understand the reference and the weight behind it." He paused. "There were rumours, years ago, of back-channel diplomacy conducted between the consulate in Trieste and certain Austrian elements during the unrest in Dalmatia, not official, not authorised, but effective. And the courier, caught between loyalties, likely silenced, as Hayward now has been. The pages on the table no longer looked like evidence. They looked like a memorial. I could not help but recoil at the phrase. It struck with a peculiar violence, as though cutting into something sacred. "A knight?" I asked. "You don't believe he meant that literally?" Holmes gave me a glance that held no amusement. "You are thinking of the kind bestowed with lance and ceremony," he said. "But diplomatic circles have their own orders, men elevated not by battlefield glory, but by quiet utility. Hartley was knighted in 87. Services rendered in the Adriatic, so the papers said. But those of us who paid attention knew it came not after a war, but after an agreement." "You think Hayward was referring to him?" "I think Hayward, who had every reason to be precise, chose the phrase 'a knight' for a reason. And he bowed, not to his own queen, but to the pressures of foreign peace, at the cost of his conscience and others' lives." The lantern cast Holmes's face in severe relief. For once, I saw not the reasoning machine, but the man who bore the weight of what he could not speak aloud. He sat again and folded the remnants of the letter, placing them back into their envelope with uncharacteristic care. Then he removed his cigarette case, lit one, and stared into the flame of the oil lamp with a gaze that rarely strayed so far from reason. "Do you know, Watson," he said quietly, "I have been consulted on the disappearances of ministers, the forgeries of monarchs, and the sins of men far more powerful than they are wise. And yet I do not recall feeling quite as I do now." "Which is?" "That we have stepped beyond deduction. We are no longer looking at evidence. We are looking at the corpse of something larger, an ideal, perhaps, honour, or truth." The smoke curled between us like the breath of something long extinguished. I could find no reply that did not feel hollow in my throat. He gave a long sigh, then rose. "This is no longer a matter of justice," he said. "It is the anatomy of silence." We spoke little that evening. It was not until past midnight that Holmes, standing near the window with the shutters half closed, finally gave voice to what I sensed had weighed on him since we left the embassy. "There are crimes, Watson," he said, "that lurk in alleys and speak in shouts. And there are others that sign dispatches, draft treaties, and host dinners." He turned slightly toward me. "The latter are never punished, because they do not flee, they do not threaten, they remain upright, in uniform." He let the curtain fall, and for a moment the room darkened, as if the city itself had turned its face away. "What then," I asked softly, "is the purpose of uncovering them?" He met my eyes, "So that someone, someday, will know they were not buried unspoken." We stood in the courtyard behind the palazzo. The fog drifted low, clinging to the flagstones like a veil of history unwilling to part. Holmes held the letter above the lantern's flame. The paper curled slowly, its blackening edges flinching in the heat, then yielded. I watched it burn, the last trace of Hayward's confession vanishing into smoke. The air smelled briefly of wax and something older. Holmes said nothing, and I who have seen murderers hang and heroes forgotten, could not decide whether what we had destroyed was a lie too dangerous to preserve, or a truth too fragile to serve. Venetian evenings possess a kind of theatricality that requires no stage. That night, the palazzo of Sir Reginald Hartley glowed with the outward dignity of empire. Brass lanterns catching the amber sheen of the canal. Strings of papered lamps reflected like trembling stars on water, and servants in muted livery ushering guests with mechanical grace. But beneath the polished gestures and murmured introductions, I detected something more brittle, the caution of men playing roles they no longer chose. Holmes and I arrived precisely on the hour, crossing the moored platform that served as an improvised quay. A gondolier took our names with a nod, and we were led into the heart of the building, its stone halls softened by velvet drapes and the low hum of cultivated laughter. Sir Reginald greeted us with his usual poise, but I noted the way his eyes flicked, first to Holmes, then briefly to the doors behind us, as though checking the guest list for ghosts. "The British delegation," he murmured with a tight smile, "is now complete." Holmes inclined his head, but did not smile. "One must always hope," he said softly, "that all expected guests are accounted for." The dining hall was long and adorned with mirrors, their frames worn to dull gold. The faces reflected therein wore the expression of practiced civility. Men and women of station, each with their allegiances folded neatly beside their soup spoons. The talk was of tariffs, of neutral ports, of opera, of cholera. Never, of course, in the same breath. Holmes, seated 2 places from Sir Reginald, contributed little beyond the occasional nod. I, being somewhat more conversational by nature, and of lesser political utility, was engaged in pleasantries with a Belgian trade commissioner and the wife of a French attaché whose understanding of English extended only to the discussion of hats. Yet I could not help but watch Holmes. He chewed slowly, sipped rarely, and spoke almost not at all, but his eyes moved, from glass to plate to guest to host, and though he never once looked directly at Sir Reginald, I sensed that every word spoken across the table was, for him, a thread, one he was quietly gathering into a noose. When dessert was announced, he declined with a quiet grace. "My appetite," he said to no one in particular, "has become selective." It was during the port, a fine Croatian vintage served with candied orange peel, that the remark fell, deliberate in its indifference. Colonel Adler von Stein, a man with a moustache sharpened into irony and eyes dulled by conquest, had been entertaining the Belgian minister with anecdotes from the frontier. Between them was Sir Reginald, who sipped without conviction and nodded with fixed detachment. "It is a pity," said the colonel, glancing idly at the chandelier, "that loyal servants often find their most useful reward is to be left where they fall, or where they float." There was a pause. Not a silence, but a hesitation, the sort that clings to words too clearly understood. Sir Reginald's hand, which had been resting on the stem of his wineglass, tightened. I saw the crystal tremble, once, and then steady. He did not look at the colonel. He merely lifted the glass, drank it dry in one measured breath, and set it down with careful precision. No one commented, and yet the temperature of the room changed. Holmes turned slightly in his chair, catching my eye. He gave no sign, no frown or arch of brow. And yet I knew at once that something had landed. Candlelight can do curious things to a face. Soften guilt, exaggerate courage, disguise intent. That night, it revealed more than perhaps it was meant to. As the guests murmured politely and forks chimed against porcelain, I saw Holmes glance across the table, just once, and with no flourish and meet the eyes of Sir Reginald. It was not a glare, nor even a challenge. It was a stillness, precise, quiet, and unwavering. Hartley returned the look for no more than 3 seconds. Then his gaze faltered, broke, and turned downward, to his napkin, his plate, the small ridged line in the tablecloth, anywhere but to the man whose eyes, it seemed, had already read him. Holmes said nothing, nor did Hartley. But in that brief exchange, I felt the room shift again. Not for the guests, they continued with their diplomatic murmurings, but for the two men at the table who no longer spoke in words. And for me, watching, the moment lingered like a note not struck, unfinished, unresolved. It was not until nearly midnight that Holmes and I found ourselves again in the salon, where decanters gleamed dully beneath an oil portrait of Disraeli, and the lamps had been lowered to a diplomatic dimness. Hartley entered with the quiet of one who knew the meeting was inevitable. There were no servants, no chairs offered, no brandy poured, only the hush between men who no longer needed introductions. Holmes turned slowly. "You knew," he said, not with fury, but with the weight of something already understood. "From the moment Hayward returned, you knew what he had seen, you knew what he carried, and still you told him to remain." Hartley did not answer. "He was not mad, Sir Reginald. He was inconvenient. That, I believe, is a more unforgivable condition within these walls." Holmes took a single step forward. "Did Hayward's sense of duty," he asked, "exceed your sense of loyalty?" Hartley remained very still. His mouth did not move, but I saw his throat shift. A breath caught, released slowly. There were no protests, no explanations, only silence. And in that silence, I sensed confession, not declared, but implied, the kind that men in Hartley's position never put to ink. The silence lingered like a weight suspended between them, a moment neither man wished to break, for it was not an accusation that hovered, but history itself. Hartley did not speak. His hands remained at his sides, open. His jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed. His nostrils flared once, not in anger, but restraint. A breath drawn, measured, and released without sound. Holmes looked at him, not as one man to another, but as one historian to a ruin. At last, Holmes turned away. "You will not be punished," he said, almost absently. "That is the privilege of your station." Hartley did not follow as we departed the salon. He remained behind, among the mirrors, beneath the old chandeliers, a figure neither innocent nor condemned, merely remembered. And as the doors closed behind us, I knew that no headline would ever bear his name, and no justice would ever seek his hand. But Holmes. Holmes had marked him in full, and I would carry the mark in memory as well. The morning after the dinner at the Palazzo, the air had turned colder, as if the city itself had drawn its shawl more tightly about its shoulders. We were seated at our breakfast, a modest arrangement of hard rolls, coffee, and silence, when a knock sounded at the door. It was a messenger from the consulate. He bore no letter, no badge, no explanation, only a wooden box, narrow, aged, and bound with a clasp of brass tarnished by salt air. He offered it to Holmes with a bowed head and vanished down the stair as silently as he had arrived. Holmes examined the box without opening it. There was no writing, no card. But on the clasp, etched faintly but unmistakably, was the embossed crest of Sir Reginald Hartley's office. Not a signature, but a seal. Not an order, but a gesture. He placed it gently on the table between us and said, "This is how diplomats speak when they no longer wish to be heard." I reached for my coffee. Holmes reached for his knife. The lid opened without resistance, revealing a folded velvet cloth and nothing else. For a moment, it appeared empty, until Holmes turned the box upon its side and ran his fingers along the grain of the wood. A soft click. He pressed into the bottom panel. It gave way, rising just enough for him to lift it out. Beneath was a hollow, and within that, a journal. Thick, leather-bound, and water-stained along the spine. Its pages were stiff with salt. Its corners curled like old bark. The clasp had long since broken, but the imprint of the seal, Hayward's own, remained upon the first leaf. Holmes opened it slowly. The script inside was firm, direct. Each line written as though no second draft would be allowed. No index, no preamble, just entries, arranged by place and date, and above them all, a single line. Should I not return, let this be my return. Holmes turned the first page, and the room fell away. The entries were terse at first, mere notations of movements and meetings, a rendezvous at Zara, an intercepted communique in Split, an informant in Kotor who had vanished before contact. But as Holmes read on, the pattern emerged. Hayward had traced the route of the missing courier, a man known only by his initials, from Trieste to the edge of Montenegro. Along the way, he had encountered references to the Whisper arrangement, an unrecorded understanding between certain British intermediaries and Austrian military officers. The language was veiled but unmistakable. Holmes read aloud. They used the courier as leverage, gave him false documents, sent him into the interior, then made certain he never reached the return post. His death would be attributed to banditry, but the Austrians knew, and so did we. In a later entry, Hartley called it a diplomatic inevitability. I call it a grave. The narrative that unfolded was not that of a spy, but of a man caught between duty and conscience. He had uncovered what he was not meant to see, and seen what no man could write without forfeiting his life. It was in the final pages that Hayward's voice shifted. The precise accounting gave way to something raw, not panic, but clarity born of resignation. They have stopped answering my cables, he wrote. My stipend was withheld last week. I asked for orders. I received silence. That is the order. The name came next, not buried, not veiled, but written plainly. Sir Reginald Hartley, followed by a single line beneath it. He told me it was not personal, that I had served well, but too long, that history has no room for men who carry the truth beyond their usefulness. There was no bitterness in the writing, only a finality that struck deeper than any anger. I do not blame him, Hayward added. He serves something larger than justice, but I write this in defiance, not of him, but of forgetting. I will not vanish wholly. Holmes closed the book and placed his hand atop it. He was wrong, he said. He will vanish, because that is the cost of clarity. Later that day, Holmes requested an audience with the Venetian chief of police, a courteous white-haired man named Belladonna, who had presided over the recovery of Hayward's body with the clinical detachment of one accustomed to drowning. Holmes placed the journal upon the man's desk without flourish. This, he said, may offer an account of your unidentified corpse, but I caution you, it will yield nothing for the courtroom and everything for your conscience. The chief turned a few pages, then looked up. If what you imply is true, he said in measured Italian, I cannot use this. No, Holmes agreed, nor should you. There was a pause. Holmes extended his hand, and Belladonna, after the slightest hesitation, slid the journal back across the desk. No record was made, no witnesses summoned. The matter, as far as the city was concerned, remained a case of unknown identity. As we departed, Holmes did not look back. I, however, turned once and saw Belladonna staring at the journal with the quiet sadness of a man who has decided, at last, to forget something he now knows. That evening, as the bells tolled the 9th hour, we stood beside the northern canal, where the water glistened dark and still. The air smelled of moss and iron, of endings. Holmes held the journal, now wrapped in oilskin, in his hand. He did not speak, but his silence was heavy with thought. I could not tell whether he hesitated from doubt or reverence. With one smooth motion, he knelt and placed it in the water. The current took it gently, and it drifted, almost reverently, into the shadows beneath the stone bridge. Let the lagoon keep what the empire cannot bear, he said at last. I watched it vanish, not with drama, but with the quiet grace of something meant to disappear. We remained there a while longer, saying nothing. The truth had not been shouted. It had not been prosecuted, printed, or preserved, but it had, at least, been witnessed. London received us not with thunder or rain, but with an indifference colder than any storm. The city, with its smoke-streaked skyline and murmuring streets, resumed its tireless march, oblivious to the currents that had passed between Venice and Baker Street. Yet I carried that Mediterranean silence with me like salt on the skin, and I dare say Holmes carried it deeper still. He did not speak of the journey, nor the journal, nor of Hayward's eyes staring into a lagoon that now served as his tomb, but I saw it in the way he moved, or rather, how he did not move. He walked with purpose, but without momentum. He answered letters, but left them unsigned. The click of the latch at our door no longer stirred him. If Venice had been the setting of unspoken truths, then London became the echo chamber where those truths were locked away, not by force, but by the quiet insistence of a society too seasoned in discretion. Even Mrs. Hudson, though never one to pry, glanced more often at the closed parlour door. Perhaps she too sensed that something had returned with us, and that it had no intention of leaving. In the weeks that followed, Holmes sank into a solitude I had witnessed only twice before, once after the affair at Reichenbach, and again following the tragic death of young Lord Darlington. But this retreat bore a different flavour. It was not grief, nor fatigue, nor even his familiar boredom. It was the quiet recoil of a mind forced to observe what it had never desired to prove. He sat for hours by the window, hands steepled under his chin, his gaze fixed upon the passers-by as if searching for something they did not know they carried. The violin lay untouched, its strings slowly falling out of tune. The tobacco jar remained closed, despite my replenishing it in silent hope. One morning, I found a monograph of his on maritime signalling open to a page that bore no mark of interest. Another day, he reread a newspaper article 3 times and offered no remark. It was not apathy, it was introspection, of the sort that digs not for facts, but for ethics. He once told me that he did not permit the world to distract him with conscience, but now it seemed conscience had found its own path in. Moved by instinct more than clarity, I began drafting my notes on the Venetian affair, something to return the structure to memory, to pin events into place with the reassuring precision of time and language. I recounted the strange telegram, the embassy's silent corridors, the charred letter that had refused to vanish. But when I reached the journal, the confession beneath a seal of silence, my hand faltered. Not from doubt in the facts, nor lack of narrative. Rather, it was the nature of the tale itself. What claim had the public to a truth buried not for justice, but for survival? What justice could it offer now to Hayward, drowned and dishonoured by design? And how could I, a physician by trade and chronicler by circumstance, lay open the work of diplomacy that had made a ghost of a man and a theatre of a city? I folded the manuscript and returned it to my drawer. Not every case, I reminded myself, belongs to posterity. Some remain for memory, others for silence. And some truths, like bodies, are never meant to float to the surface. It was on a rain-tapped night, with gaslight flickering low and the fire reduced to sullen embers, that Holmes finally broke his silence. "I am not certain," he said, without turning from the hearth, "whether Hayward was the victim of betrayal or merely its witness." I laid aside the book I had not been reading. "Does it make a difference?" "To conscience," he murmured. "Yes, but not to history. History prefers clean endings, not the muddy banks of rivers where guilt anchors itself with medals and mandates." He turned then, and his eyes bore the distant light of someone watching a far-off ship founder in silence. "There are men, Watson, who commit crimes and escape justice because they committed them on behalf of the just, and there are others who preserve honour only by being forgotten." I offered no reply. What could I say to such a conclusion, born not from deduction, but from the bitter clarity that follows it? In that moment, I saw not only the detective, but the man who must live among the aftermath of his own discoveries, and I knew this was not a case we would speak of again. What remains with me, even now, is not the journal, nor the embassy, nor even the corpse, fished from the canal. It is the final glimpse I caught as our steamer slipped from Venice's port that cold Venetian dawn. A gondola, solitary, black, and gliding without oar, drifted along a lesser canal, its passenger shrouded and unmoving. Whether it was a mourner, a priest, or only some early tradesman, I could not tell. But it vanished into the mist with such solemnity that I could not help but feel the city itself had bowed to acknowledge some internal grief. I turned to Holmes to speak of it, but he was already looking away, not at the gondola, but at the water it passed over. I wonder, I said quietly, if Venice ever truly forgets those it buries. To which Holmes replied, almost absently, "It forgets nothing, Watson. It simply allows the forgetting to happen elsewhere. That image of a city made of ghosts and water has followed me longer than most memories should. And so it is that I have not published the account of Charles Hayward's death, nor the tangled theatre of motives in which it was staged. The facts are known to Holmes, to myself, and perhaps to a handful of others who will never admit their knowledge aloud, but they shall not appear in the Strand, nor in any future collection bearing my name. For once, I find that the case has been solved in intellect, but not in conscience. The deductions are sound, the truth uncovered. Yet what that truth reveals, about loyalty, about nations, about the cost of knowledge, cannot be made palatable for a public that craves endings. There is no villain to name, no justice to praise. Only the quiet vanishing of a man who knew too much, and the reluctant complicity of those who knew better. Holmes, for his part, has resumed his habits in degrees. The violin plays again, though never the Venetian barcarolle he once idly hummed. I too have returned to other matters, but some nights, when the fog thickens over the Thames, I recall that watery city and the truth it swallowed, and I wonder whether justice can drown without leaving ripples. I suspect nisnawet that it can. We sat in silence that evening, the fire casting soft shadows across Holmes's sharp profile. He did not smoke nor speak for a long while. At last he stirred. "There are cases, Watson, in which the crime lies not in what is done, but in what is permitted. A death may be regrettable," he said, "but a truth suppressed by those sworn to uphold it, that is the quieter catastrophe." I offered no reply, for there was little left to say. The Venetian mist might have lifted from our shoulders, but not from the conscience it had quietly soaked. What do you think was the greatest betrayal in this story? The silence, the forgery, or the mask of honour worn by those in power? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would truly like to hear them. And if you found this mystery as haunting as I did, do share it with fellow lovers of deduction, subscribe for more untold cases of Holmes, and join us again as we tread further into the shadows.